So, a very warm good evening to all of you. We are back again with the session of critical reasoning of CLAT Ke Funde, this initiative of CLAT Gurukul. And as you all are aware that under this initiative of CLAT Ke Funde, we are conducting sessions on various topics of CLAT, various sections of CLAT. So it's going to be a very detailed program wherein we are going to conduct sessions from all the topics relevant for CLAT. So it's going to be a very highly interactive session with all of the students. So it will be better if you people keep sharing this to as many people as you can. So like this session, share this session as much as is possible to as many people, convey this message to as many people regarding this initiative of CLAT Gurukul. It will be of great help. I can see a lot many people are joining. So good evening, Priyanshu. Good evening, Rifat. Good evening, Rabnees. Sujit Hole, good afternoon. Shivam Bhardwaj, good evening. Sajubi, good evening. Asmita, good evening. Sonali, good evening. Sagar Singh, good evening. Bubbly Singh, good evening. So we'll wait for a minute for you people to join. So what I was saying is, under this initiative, we are conducting programs of all the sections relevant for CLAT. We are conducting classes for all the sections of CLAT. And it is highly desirable from your side that you people keep sharing feedbacks. I mean, if you share your feedbacks, we can tweak in the program, we can do certain changes, we can incorporate your feedbacks and try to re-engineer this program based on your requirements, the requirements that suits you. So with this, it is advisable that you keep sharing, and I think people have joined. So let us get started. In the previous class, if you remember, in the previous class of critical reasoning, we had started with arguments. In the very first class, we had talked about what is critical reasoning and what all are we going to discuss in critical reasoning. And in the second class, we had started with the most important part of the critical reasoning topic, which is arguments. I had highlighted the CLAT syllabus in which there was emphasis on analysis of arguments. So we got started with arguments, and we tried to understand what argument is all about. So in the previous class, we broke up these arguments into certain parts, and we tried to understand those parts of the argument. So if you remember, we broke up those arguments in three parts. We said that an argument is essentially made up of three parts. One was conclusion, the other was premise, and yet other was assumption. Assumption was a hidden link between premise and conclusion. So for any argument, what is essential? For any argument, the essential thing is there has to be a conclusion. Conclusion must be there. And how do we arrive to a conclusion? We arrive to a conclusion through a premise. So if a conclusion is there, a premise has to be there. Otherwise, that conclusion will become, if the premise is missing, that conclusion will not be a conclusion, it will be rather called as an assertion. It won't be called it won't be termed a conclusion. We had taken, or rather a dogmatic statement. We had seen the examples of those things. Now, moving further, in the class, if you remember, we tried to define everything. We tried to define what is a premise. And I said that a premise is something, whenever you are asked to identify a premise, you better ask this question: why is something to be believed? Why does the author want me to believe something? Or why does the author want me to believe the conclusion? And what is a conclusion? Conclusion को अगर figure out करना है, if you want to figure out what is the conclusion of the argument, you better ask this question: what does the author want me to believe? मतलब author वो जो passage लिखा है उसके थ्रू आपको क्या कन्विंस करना चाहता है, आपको क्या कन्वे करना चाहता है, that is called as conclusion of that particular argument. ठीक है? So for that you need to ask this question: what is to be believed? The answer of this particular question will be the conclusion of the argument. And why is something to be believed? The answer to this question will be the premise of the argument. Now, assumption is nothing but a hidden link between the premise and the conclusion. Now, I had said that assumption is a hidden premise, something which is not stated. क्योंकि अगर state कर दिया गया तब वो assumption रहा ही नहीं, तब वो premise हो जाता है. So something which is not explicitly mentioned in the paragraph but gives a reason for you to believe the conclusion is called an assumption, and or rather a hidden premise. Now, after that, we had started identifying the different parts of the arguments through a drill in which we were given a particular argument, and we tried to identify whether that argument, whether that set of statements was a fact set or an argument. If it was an argument, then what was the conclusion, what was the premise, and what was the assumption. So we'll carry forward from where we left in the previous class and do do some more exercises. So we'll start from where we left. So if you remember, this was the last question that we had done in the previous class. Just a brief recap of this. This question was done in the previous class, and this question said, fraud has cost the insurance industry millions of dollars in lost revenue. Thus, Congress will pass a stricter fraud control bill since the insurance industry has one of the most powerful lobbies. So if you remember, we had given you certain conclusion identifiers as well as premise identifiers. So if you look at the list of conclusion identifiers, these are conclusion identifiers. Here you can see thus is a conclusion identifier, whereas since is a premise identifier, है ना? तो ये 10 जिसके पहले लग गया वो कंक्लूजन होगा, और सिंस जिसके पहले लग गया वो प्रेमाइस होगा. ठीक है? नाउ मूविंग टू द क्वेश्चन. Yes, the question was, fraud has cost the insurance industry millions of dollars in lost revenue. Thus, Congress will pass out. So here you can identify that qualifier identifier has been used. thus. So thus is what? A conclusion identifier. So this is a conclusion identifier. So what will be the conclusion of this statement? Congress will pass a stricter fraud control bill. This happens to be the conclusion. So if you ask this particular question to yourself, that what does the author want me to believe? What does the author want to convey, or what does the author want me to convince about by saying these set of statements? So the author wants to convince you that the Congress will pass a stricter fraud control bill. So this becomes the conclusion of the argument. Now, what all are the premises? So everything else will become a premise. So out here you can also see that there is a identifier which is since. Since is a premise identifier. What type of identifier is this? It's a premise identifier. So we can say that there are two premises here. First premise is, now what is a premise? The answer to the question, why does the author want me to believe the conclusion? Yani, why does the author want me to believe that Congress will pass a stricter fraud control bill? So the author has given two reasons for this. The first reason is because fraud has cost the insurance industry millions of dollars in lost revenue. This is reason number one. Therefore, it is called as premise one, P1. And this is the reason number two. The insurance industry has one of the most powerful lobbies. So this is the reason number two. Therefore, it is called as premise two, or rather P2. है So in this argument, you could clearly see that there are two premises and there is one conclusion. ठीक है? So, sir, can there be two conclusions in Premansu Singh is asking, sir, can there be two conclusions in an argument? Yes, Premansu, there can be two or more than two conclusions in an argument. Such arguments are called as complex arguments. क्या कहलाते हैं ऐसे arguments? Such arguments are called as complex arguments. We will see such kind of arguments in the next class. वैसे arguments के बारे में हम लोग next class में discuss करेंगे. But there are definitely arguments in which there are more than one conclusion. So there is one final conclusion and there is yet another intermediary conclusion. Such arguments are called as complex arguments. So I believe I have answered your question. And what about assumptions? Yes, Anurag Srivastav, there could be more than one or more than one assumptions in a set of statements that may have happened. Saju is saying they are hidden premises. Yeah, assumptions are hidden premises. Very rightly said, Saju B. ठीक है. Now moving further, हम लोग जरा. So the question asked here was, how many premises are there? So how many premises can you figure out here? There are two premises. कितने premises हैं? There are two premises. Now let us move to the next question. Next question पे आ जाइए. Now question number 7. It says, now answer me the premises and the conclusion whether question number 7 is a fact set or an argument. If it is an argument, what is the premise and what is the conclusion? Please answer me quickly. Please answer to my question quickly. The question says, therefore, since higher debt has forced consumers to lower their savings, banks now have less money to loan. Now, it is an argument, very true. Everyone is saying that seventh statement is a set of statements is an argument, very rightly said. Now, it's a very peculiar statement, very peculiar question. Here you can see that two identifiers, therefore and since, both have been used. Now, therefore is a conclusion identifier, whereas since is a premise identifier. Now, both have been used together. There are certain statements where both the identifiers sometimes come together. So what about those type of statements? Then what will be the fate of this statement, higher debt has forced consumers to lower their savings? Guys, you need to note down that just because therefore is present here, that does not mean that higher debt has forced consumers to lower their savings becomes a conclusion. It does not mean. यहां पे देखिए, इसके पहले सिंस भी लगा हुआ है. सो इसके पहले सिंस लगा हुआ है तो ये हो गया प्रेमाइस. इट्स रादर अ प्रेमाइस. And what will be the conclusion of this statement? So the conclusion, you better ask this question. You ask this question, what does the author want me to believe? He wants me to believe that banks now have less money to loan. So this is the conclusion. So even if this conclusion is not preceded by an identifier, you can clearly identify that this is a conclusion, and the rest part is the premise. और बाकी जो बचा वो क्या हो गया? वो premise हो गया. ठीक है? So is there any confusion in this? क्या कोई confusion है? Anurag Srivastav is saying loan is conclusion. Yeah, very good. Sir, please get aside. Okay, I'll leave the screen. Now, can you all see the board? Is the board visible to all of you clearly? Okay. Now, answer to this particular question, question number 8. 8 का आंसर कीजिए. What is this? Is it an argument or it's a... So Rifat Hayat is saying banks now have less money to loan. Yes. Now come to question number 8, Rifat. So 8 is an argument. Shivam Bhardwaj is saying 8 is an argument. Given the price of steel is rising, we will no longer be able to offer discounts on our car parts. So what is to be believed? What does the author want me to believe? That we will no longer be able to offer discounts on our car parts. So this is the conclusion. ये हो गया क्या? This becomes the conclusion. And this part, given that acts as an identifier, what type of identifier? Premise identifier. So this becomes the premise. Is it clear to all of you? Is it clear to all of you? Okay, very good. Very good. Moving further, let us move to the next question. Question number 9. The political situation in Somalia is unstable owing to the ability of individual warlords to maintain powerful armed forces. So, what is to be believed? Question number 9. Saju B is saying that it is a fact set. Arif Wakar is saying that it's an argument. Arif Wakar, you are right. Saju B, you are wrong. You can clearly make out that, ask this question, what does the statement want you to believe? The political situation in Somalia is unstable. This is to be believed. And why is it unstable? It is giving a reason. यहाँ पे देखिए ये रीजन दिया, owing to मतलब क्या होता है? Because. Owing to का मतलब because. See, your CR more or less depends upon the kind of reading, the kind of English comprehension skills. So, if you people want to improve your CR performance in CR, please try to improve English as much as you can. Try to be a versatile reader, get hold of newspapers, read newspapers on a regular basis, come across different news articles, read them thoroughly. This will enhance your reading prowess. So, what is to be believed? The political situation in Somalia is unstable. ठीक है? तो ये हो गया क्या? ये हो गया conclusion. Conclusion. ठीक है? And owing to मतलब because, the reason being owing to का मतलब reason being the ability of individual warlords. Why is it so? Because of the ability of individual warlords to maintain powerful armed forces. So this becomes the premise. Clear? Do you have any confusion in this? Do you have any confusion in this? Okay. So should we move further? Now here are yet another statements. Question number 10. Question number 10. Since we need to have many different interests to sustain us, the scientist's belief must be incorrect. So here, what is the conclusion? Tell me, yeah, argument, this is an argument, very right, rightly said. All of you are correct in saying that this is an argument. Now tell me what is the conclusion. Please tell me what is the conclusion. जल्दी से बताइए conclusion क्या है? What is the conclusion? Now the conclusion is the scientist's belief must be. Yes. The conclusion is the scientist's belief must be incorrect, and since is a premise indicator, since we need to have many different interests to sustain us. This is a premise. Moving further, come to question number, so 10 we have done, come to question number 11. Come to question number 11. 11 को फटाफट आंसर कीजिए. Come to question number 11. So as indicated by the newly released data, we should push forward with our efforts to recolonize the forest with snowy tree crickets. With snowy tree crickets. So what is the conclusion? Argument, very good. Asmita Day is saying it's a fact set. No, Asmita, it is an argument. So as indicated by, it is giving you an instance. This acts as a premise indicator. Premise indicator. And we should push. What should we do? What does the author want me to believe? Yes, Ashmita, I am answering to you. What should the author want you to believe? That we should push forward with our effort to recolonize the forest with snowy tree cricket. So this becomes the conclusion, and the other one becomes the premise. So this becomes the premise. So hope this is clear to all of you. Hope this is clear to all of you. Should we move further? आगे बढ़ा जाए? Yes. Now this is a bit complex statement. So now read this one and try answering. Read this one and try answering what should be the answer. It's an argument, very good. What is the conclusion? Conclusion, television has a harmful effect on our society, and remaining part is premise. Very good. Premanshu, you are very bang on the answer. You are hats off to you, Premanshu. Your answer is right. Television has a harmful effect on society. See, this statement is the conclusion, and rest everything has been used to substantiate the first statement. मतलब बाकी सब कुछ कहा जा रहा है इस पहला स्टेटमेंट को सब्सटेंशिएट करने के लिए, इसको रीजन, इसका करेक्ट रीजन एक्सप्लेन करने के लिए, बताने के लिए कि क्यों ऐसा है कि टेलीविजन हैज हार्मफुल इफेक्ट ऑन आवर सोसाइटी. सो दिस पार्ट बिकम्स द कंक्लूजन. This becomes the conclusion, and this can be seen from the poor school performance of children who once watch significant amount of television. So ये हो गया premise 1. And from the fact ये हो गया premise 2. देखिए यहां तक हो गया premise 1. And from the fact, ये another fact दे रहा है that children who watch more than 6 hours of television, 6 hours of television a day tend to read less than non-television watching children. So this becomes the premise 2. So here there are 2 premises and 1 conclusion. So the conclusion is the very first statement, whereas the premises has been depicted out here. So is it clear to all of you? Is it clear to all of you? Should we move further? Now come to question number 13. Now tell me about question number 13. Tell me about question number 13. The rapid diminishment of the ecosystem of the Amazon threatens the entire planet. Consequently, we must take, देखिए यहाँ पे consequently is the conclusion indicator. कौन सा indicator है? This is the conclusion indicator. तो ये हो गया, we must take immediate action to convince the Brazilian government that plant development projects need to be curtailed यहाँ तक. This becomes consequently से लेके यहाँ तक, this becomes the conclusion. ठीक है? And what is the reason? The rapid diminishment of ecosystem of the Amazon threatens the entire planet. This is premise 1. Premise 1. This is reason 1. Premise 1. And there's another reason, simple reason, that these development projects will greatly accelerate the loss of currently protected land. ठीक है? So this is reason 2. ठीक है? Very good. Asmita, you are right. Rifat, you are also right. Saju B is also correct. So, by and large, everyone is getting the right answers very quickly. So, I think all of you had benefited from this session. Now, this was all about the discussion of premises and conclusion. Now, in certain arguments, you will come across additional premises. ठीक है? You have come across premises like premise 1 and premise 2. But there is something called as an additional premise. So, like to explain a conclusion, to arrive at a conclusion, in the earlier instances, you were provided with one reason. In some cases, you were provided with two reasons to arrive at a particular conclusion. So, in case if you were given two reasons to arrive at a particular conclusion, then in those cases there were two premises. There can be a number of premises. There can be 3 premises, 4 premises, a number of premises. But what is an additional premise? Now, if you look at the additional premise, sometimes the author will make an argument and then, for good measure, add another premise. He'll add another premise that supports the conclusion but is sometimes non-essential. So the keyword is non-essential. Non-essential to the conclusion. मतलब अगर उस प्रेमाइस को नहीं भी दिया जाए ना, तो कंक्लूजन पे आप अराइव कर सकते हैं. अगर उस प्रेमाइस को नहीं भी दिया, प्रेमाइस क्या होता है? प्रेमाइस इज अ रीजन explained, given as an explanation to a conclusion. So even if there could be two reasons for arriving at a conclusion, In some cases, it may happen that one premise is sufficient to explain a particular conclusion. But even after giving that particular premise, the author gives yet another premise which acts as which supports the conclusion but is नॉन एसेंशियल टू द कंक्लूजन. मतलब उसको नहीं भी दिया जाए ना तो हमारा काम, हमारा पर्पस जो है वो सॉल्व हो जाएगा. सो दीज आर नोन एज एडिशनल प्रेमाइसेस. एंड व्हाट आर एडिशनल प्रेमाइस इंडिकेटर्स? द एडिशनल प्रेमाइस इंडिकेटर्स आर फर्दर मोर. फर्दर मोर मतलब एक और रीजन दिया जा रहा है. मोर ओवर, बिसाइड्स, इन एडिशन, व्हाट्स मोर. So these are additional premise indicators. Now take an example. Identifying additional premises. Now read this set of statements. This is an argument. Just try to answer me. What is the conclusion? What is the premise? And what is the additional premise? अब इसमें एडिशनल प्रेमाइस क्या है? सर, इज एडिशनल प्रेमाइस प्रेजेंट इन लॉन्ग आर्ग्यूमेंट्स? प्रेमांशु, इन लॉन्ग, सी, generally additional premises are present in long arguments, because in long arguments an argument becomes long when you are giving more than one premises. Then only the argument becomes long. So it generally happens that in long arguments there are chances of an additional argument to be present, additional premise to be present, but it is not necessary that every long argument will have a additional premise. So coming to this question, every professor at Fillmore University teaches exactly one class per semester. ठीक है? Fillmore's Professor Jackson, therefore, is teaching exactly one class this semester. अब देखिए, Fillmore's Professor Jackson, therefore, premise conclusion indicator, is teaching exactly one class this semester. This becomes the conclusion. This is the conclusion. And what is the premise? This is the premise. This is the premise. So what is the premise? Every professor at Fillmore University teaches exactly one class per semester. ये हो गया premise. अब इस premise से we can arrive to the conclusion that since Professor Jackson is a professor of Fillmore University, therefore he is teaching exactly one class per this semester. Moreover, I heard Professor Jackson say she was teaching only a single class. So since they are teaching exactly one class this semester, so Professor, अब ये जो second statement है ना, moreover, here you can see that it is an additional premise indicator. Additional premise indicator. So moreover, I heard Professor Jackson say she was teaching only a single class. So this was not at all required. ये required नहीं था. अगर ये नहीं भी कहा जाता तो हम लोग कह सकते थे कि प्रोफेसर जैक्सन, being a Fillmore University professor, is teaching exactly one class this semester. ये हम लोग कह सकते थे, बट ये इसने एडिशनली ये बात कह दी है. सो दिस इज एन एडिशनल प्रेमाइस. ठीक है ना? ये हो गया हमारा एडिशनल प्रेमाइस. मूविंग फर्दर, आई होप you all of you have understood this. It's actually is, yeah. Now the second example of this, the city council ought to ease restrictions on outdoor advertising because the city's economy is currently in slum. Furthermore, the city should not place restrictions on forms of speech such as advertising. So, what is the conclusion? The city council ought to ease restrictions on outdoor advertising. This is the conclusion. What does the author want me to believe? He wants me to believe that the city council ought to ease. क्या करना चाहिए उसको? It ought to ease restrictions on the outdoor advertising. And what is the reason being given for that? Because the city's economy is currently in some slum. क्योंकि सिटी का इकोनॉमी जो है वो अभी स्लम में है, वो गर्दिश में है. ठीक है. Furthermore is an additional premise indicator. The city should not place restrictions on forms of speech such as advertising. So even if this was not required to substantiate the fact that the city council ought to ease restrictions on outdoor advertising, the additional premise has been given. Now this additional premise gives you another reason to explain this. But even if it was not there, the conclusion could be substantiated. So this acts as an additional premise. Now moving further. Now on the same line, we also have a counter premise. We have seen additional premise, now we will see a counter premise. A premise that actually contains an idea that is counter to an argument. मतलब एक आर्ग्यूमेंट में हमने कुछ कहा, एक प्रेमाइस दिया, और जस्ट ठीक उसके उल्टा हम अगर कुछ बोल रहे हैं तो दैट इज काउंटर प्रेमाइस. कभी कभी जैसे लेट मी गिव यू एन एग्जांपल. जैसे अगर मैं मान लीजिए मैंने कहा कि Ram will top the exam because he studies hard. Ram will top the exam because he studies hard. However, his performance in the previous exam was, although his performance in the previous exam was not that good, but since this time he has put in extra effort, he is definitely going to top the exam. तो यहाँ पे कॉन्ट्रास्टिंग हमने बात कर दी कि उसने पिछला एग्जाम में अच्छा परफॉर्म नहीं किया था, ठीक है, लेकिन फिर भी हमने अपने इस बात को कहा कि ही विल टॉप द एग्जाम, उसको सब्सटेंशिएट किया. सो ये जो हमने काउंटर आर्ग्यूमेंट दिया इज कॉल्ड काउंटर स्टेटमेंट दिया है ना, वो दैट इज कॉल्ड एज काउंटर प्रेमाइस. So at first glance, this might seem like an odd thing for an author to do, but by raising the counter premise and then addressing the complaint in a direct fashion, the author can minimize the damage that would be done by objecting by the objection if it were raised elsewhere. We'll see it through an example. अभी आप देख लीजिए काउंटर प्रेमाइस इंडिकेटर्स क्या हैं. But yet, despite, however, on the other hand, in contrast, although, whereas, these all act as counter premise indicators. Now coming to the example of counter premise. Now read this statement. Read this paragraph. Wine is made by crushing grapes and eventually separating the juice from the grape skins. However, the separated juice contains impurities. So यहाँ पे however, the separated juice contains, तो however क्या चीज का इंडिकेटर है? काउंटर प्रेमाइस का. मतलब यहाँ पे जो बात कहना चाह रहा है उसके ठीक उल्टा बात कहेगा, है ना. Is eventually separating the juice from, however, the separated juice contains impurities and many wineries do not filter the juice. So this acts as a counter premise. These wineries claim that unfiltered juice ultimately produces a more flavorful and intense wine. Since these winemakers are expert, we should trust their judgment and not shy away from unfiltered wine. तो ये बता रहा है कि भाई अनफिल्टर्ड वाइन आपको लेना चाहिए, ठीक है ना। लेकिन उसके अगेंस्ट में काउंटर आर्ग्यूमेंट दिया था कि द सेपरेटेड जूस कंटेन्स इम्प्योरिटीज, यहाँ पे इम्प्योरिटीज अगेंस्ट में दिया है, एंड मेनी वाइनरीज डू नॉट फिल्टर द जूस, ठीक है। सो यहाँ पे ये जो आर्ग्यूमेंट है ना, दैट एक्ट्स एज अ काउंटर आर्ग्यूमेंट. सो there are counter argument identifiers as well, such as however, यहाँ पे जो आपने देखा but, yet, despite, however, on the other hand, in contrast, although, whereas. So when you are reading a paragraph, my sincere suggestion is whichever paragraph or whichever subject matter you are reading, make it a point, even if you are reading a newspaper, make it a point that you have certain things in mind. What does the author want you to believe? So what is going to be the conclusion of that particular paragraph? Okay? And what all are the premises? So keep in mind to figure out what is the conclusion, what all are the premises, what all are the assumptions, if there is any additional premise present or not, if there is a counter premise present or not, and just try jotting them. यहाँ पे हमने और नीलांजन सर ने क्लासेस को स्वैप कर लिया है इस वीक के लिए. So on Thursday you are going to have your English class. Tomorrow's class will be taken by Sudhir sir, that is analytical reasoning class. Friday will be legal by Abhinav sir, and on Saturday you will have 2 classes on vocab enhancer and quantitative techniques. So my again appeal to all of you that please spread the word about CLAT Ke Funde, है ना, and let us make it a huge success among the CLAT fraternity, all the aspirants of CLAT who are preparing. Let all of them get benefited from this. Thank you for watching this video. Have a great day.